Welcome to the final revision video for Paper 2, Superpower Relations in the Cold War. This is looking at key topic 3, which is the end of the Cold War, which we start from 1970, the end of the crises, up to 1991, which is the dissolvement of the Soviet Union. The first thing we're going to talk about is détente. We said already after the missile crisis of 1961, this was the peak of tensions, and after this there was a real concerted effort to reduce, to control, and to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. We saw a series of treaties passed between the two superpowers, including the Test Ban Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty as well, all designed to prevent the control. The 1970s starts this period of détente, a period of peaceful relations or better relations between the two superpowers, and one of the main causes is obviously the missile crisis, but also some of the internal problems happening within the two nations at the same time as well. Détente comes at a time when both nations are unable to continue the Cold War at the intense rate that it had been before during the 1950s. So we start to see a reduction in military spending during this time period. The United States was going through cultural and political changes as well. They had seen the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, which has obviously sent shockwaves, and his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, had lots of domestic problems at the time to contest with. Protests against the Vietnam War, which grew and grew as the war escalated, and the US were dragged further into that conflict. By 1975, the US leave the Vietnam War after decades of military spending and lives lost. The Civil Rights Act is passed in 1964, giving African Americans the same rights as white Americans. But in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, and again, the kind of tensions are high again. In the Soviet Union, shown by the last graph here, their economic growth had started to reduce after the highs of the 1930s and 40s, post-Second World War. So they had their own internal problems with that, with that as well. So détente came at a time that was needed because of the height of tensions with the missile crisis, but because of these internal problems that both nations were suffering from as well. So just to look at what détente looks like then, we already talked about some of those treaties beforehand as well. I think it's worth noting that a lot of the tension obviously had been around Germany and East and West in the 1940s and 50s and 60s as well. And we start to see that East and West Germany also start to improve relations with one another. They start to embark on a policy called Ostpolitik, which means Eastern policy. And this was a real effort from West Germany to improve relations with their partner. So reunification of Germany in the 1950s and 60s seemed impossible. By the 1970s, it seems that it could happen one day. It obviously wouldn't happen until 1990, but this is the start of that process. We see a significant treaty in SALT I being agreed, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This conversation about this treaty starts quite early on in the late 60s, and by 1972, it is when the treaty is going to be signed as well. This was an attempt to reduce the amount of nuclear missiles. So rather than controlling, we're actually seeing reduction for the first time as well. It was designed to be equal in its limitations and try to restrain the use of nuclear war. It was difficult and complicated due to the fact that the USSR and the US possessed different types. So you can see on that table there that it shows you that there was a little bit of difference in what was limited as well. Some criticized the treaty for not being realistic and that it didn't cover some of the most recent nuclear technology, and they still possessed high levels of nuclear technology regardless of this reduction anyway. SALT II, which talks began soon after this and was meant to happen later in 1979, were meant to amend some of those issues of SALT I. We know that SALT II never happens. A further consequence is a newly elected US President, Richard Nixon, is the first US president to visit the Soviet Union. He also, in the previous year, had visited China, and China at this point were communist, and again, no US president had ever visited China. And this kind of put pressure on the Soviets to interact with the United States as well. And this is why one of the reasons why SALT I is finally agreed. But Nixon goes to Moscow, he visits Brezhnev, and Brezhnev then also visits Washington as well. We talked about the hotline in the previous video, that direct communication. We're now actually seeing the president and the Soviet premier actually meeting more regularly as well. And this was only a good thing for tensions to actually ease as well. And this is where we start to see the SALT II talks develop as well. SALT I is significant. It's symbolic of détente, but obviously it had its problems as well. Another major agreement that starts from 1973, which is a consequence of these better relations with SALT II, is the Helsinki Accords. It's finally ratified in August 1975, so it's 2 years in the making. And this was in Finland, in Helsinki, and 33 nations from NATO and the Warsaw Pact all met together to try and build on the work that they had worked on during the SALT I talks as well. They essentially organized their agreements into the three baskets. They agreed that borders cannot be altered through force, so it had to be diplomatic. They agreed on international cooperation, particularly between the West and the East, and NATO and the Warsaw Pact as well. There was a joint space mission between the Soviet Union and the United States. Unlike the space race of the 50s and 60s, we actually see a joint space mission take place in the early 1970s. And there was a general acceptance that human rights and individual freedoms should be respected. Now, obviously, the Soviet Union did not believe in human rights and had proven in Hungary in 1956 and in Prague in 1968. So, whilst the Helsinki Accords were evidence of progress and better relations, the human rights side of things was an opportunity for the United States to kind of, highlight that the Soviet Union, could not abide to that as well. So there was still that underlying tension during the Helsinki Accords. And we talked about SALT II as well, obviously trying to resolve some of those problems that SALT I could not figure out. But the year 1979 is the year where détente starts to end as well. And despite this improved feeling between the two superpowers, it's too easy for us to just think that the tension had completely disappeared. That's not the case as well. Many people in the United States had spent years and years being told that the USSR were the enemy, that communism was evil. So many found it difficult to accept these new relations, and some believed that actually it was a sign of weakness, and the United States were showing weakness. And this all came to a head in November 1979 when the American embassy in Tehran, in Iran, was actually captured, and American diplomats and their families were captured by Islamic militants. 60 of them were held hostage for 444 days as well, and many felt that détente was making the US soft, and particularly in the Middle East, which was near the Soviet Union as well. But it triggers the end of détente in December 1979 when the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan, which was a southern neighbor of the Soviet Union. Now, this invasion has many causes, but we're interested in the kind of impact, this global impact, and the reignition of the Cold War. If détente is half time, this is the second Cold War. This is the second leg. There had been a revolution in Iran in 1979, and a fundamentalist government, Muslim fundamentalist government, had toppled the government there, and they had been pro-Soviet, and the Shah of Iran, so the kind of king of Iran, had been removed, and this fundamentalist government, it takes over. The Soviets fear that this is going to then head into Afghanistan. So quite ironic, really, when you think about what happened to Europe in the 1940s with the spread of communism. They fear the same thing, and they fear their sphere of influence in the Middle East or the Persian Gulf starting to reduce as well. The pro-Soviet government is toppled by someone called Amin, and they at first thought that he was a supporter, but very quickly It appears that he's not. And it is rumoured that he's negotiating with the United States at the time as well to gather support as well. So we see Brezhnev act quite decisively, and he decides to invade Afghanistan. We talked about Vietnam being a big problem for the United States, and the war in Afghanistan will essentially mirror that of Vietnam as well. And a decade later, 15,000 Soviets will be dead. $8 billion would have been spent, so it had a huge economic cost. 1.5 million civilian casualties as well, and it ultimately triggered the end of détente as well. The US response is harsh. A new president, lots of them, President Carter, announces in 1980 his own doctrine, and we know that doctrines are always a public declaration of intent, and he announces that this is the greatest threat to world peace since the Second World War, and also a huge threat to the United States' interest in the Middle East as well. They impose economic sanctions on the USSR. They supply the Muslim guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan, shown on the left there, the Mujahideen. SALT II is revoked, that's never signed as well, and we start to see the beginning of the Second Cold War, and this truly is the end of détente. An immediate impact is then the rising tensions again, and we see the Olympic boycott. So in 1980, the Olympic Games were being hosted in Moscow, and many nations, 60 nations in total, support the USA, boycott the Moscow Games. Similarly, 4 years later in Los Angeles, where the next Olympic Games were being held, the Soviet Union and 15 other communist countries along the Warsaw Pact also boycott the 1984 Olympic Games as well. So we're just seeing this re-escalation again of tension between the two. But the major difference comes with the new US president. So in the lead up to the elections in 1981, Ronald Reagan is the Republican candidate, and Ronald Reagan was a former actor, big Hollywood star in the 1950s, and he'd been the governor of California, and his main campaign to get into the Oval Office, into the White House, is a tougher stance on communism, and he had argued that Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, had been far too soft and tougher action was needed. He famously gives a speech where in 1983, where he refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. So we see a real kind of acceleration of tensions with Reagan as well. It's all based on his plan of SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, as the media called it. Typical of Reagan as an actor to refer, for this to be called Star Wars. And this is a really pivotal moment because essentially SDI claims that the US had the technology to have satellites that could track nuclear weapons being fired and shoot them and destroy them with lasers and dismantle them. Now, the technology did not exist, but the Soviet Union were not aware of this, and this was a massive game changer. Mutually assured destruction, or MAD, had always meant that nuclear weapons, if you fired one, it meant the other side would fire as well, meaning complete destruction. If the US actually did have this technology, and the Soviets did decide to launch a nuclear missile, it would never reach its intended target, for the United States SDI program would intercept it, and then the US would fire. So this is a hugely massive, game-changing moment. He announces his own doctrine, again, in 1983-84, the Reagan Doctrine, and that the United States would, like Truman, would support any nation trying to overthrow communism. So we see the United States giving military and financial support to Central American countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Grenada. We start to see that more in Latin America, and we know that they'd lost their support after the Cuban Revolution. So 13% more spent on arms from 1982, further 8%. this is a real escalation. So 21% in total increase in military spending from 1982 to 1984. We see Trident submarines, so submarines with more nuclear warheads. We see stealth bombers, so you won't be able to track them as well. And at this time, as I said before, the Soviet economy cannot keep up. And we always ask the question, does the USA win the Cold War, or does the Soviet Union lose? And very much the Soviet Union were losing the Cold War at this time as well. Now, in the Soviet Union, Brezhnev dies in 1982, and they go through a real period of change and uncertainty as well. There's successive Soviet leaders, so Andropov and Cherenko as well, but they're old, they're weak, and it's a real time of crisis, really. And this is where we see the introduction of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev inherits the Soviet premiership, where the Soviet Union is lagging behind in the arms race, it's lagging behind technologically, the economy is weak, there's poor leadership, there's calls for reform across Eastern Europe, and this is where we start to see really the beginning of the end of communism, really, and the Cold War. Gorbachev will develop what's called his new thinking. He believes that the Soviet Union and communism needs reforming. He does not intend to destroy it. He will indirectly do that. The two of his key reforms are perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika is this idea of economic reform, and it began to show that the Soviets needed to change their economy. This wasn't the 1920s or 30s anymore, and using that kind of line of an economy just didn't work anymore. So perestroika started to encourage the use of more capitalist ideas, so more profit. In 1990, we see the very first McDonald's being opened in Moscow as well. And so this is where we start to see the end of that idea of economic communism. Glasnost encouraged more openness in government, just like Dubček had argued for in Prague in 1968. Gorbachev believes that this is the way forward, really, and that heavy government censorship is just not sustainable as well. Another key thing that he also introduces is a reduction in military spending, and he actually rejects the Brezhnev Doctrine. He realizes that the Soviets cannot afford to maintain that control anymore. And what we're going to see is the countries of the Eastern Bloc by the end of the 1980s starting to call for reform and call for democratic elections. And Gorbachev will not step in their way at this time. Now, Reagan had obviously escalated the Cold War, but Gorbachev is someone he feels is someone that he could work with, because Gorbachev was trying to reform, and Reagan's ultimate objective is for communism to end, to be destroyed. And he sees Gorbachev as someone who can make that happen. And they meet a lot. Out of all of the leaders, Khrushchev and Kennedy, and Eisenhower and Khrushchev, and Truman and Stalin, and Nixon and Brezhnev, it's these two that are symbolic of the end of the Cold War. And you can see from the imagery here is that they did respect each other and they did get along quite well. They first meet in November 1985. They meet in Geneva at a summit as well. There was no formal agreements, but they agreed to improve relations and have a good mutual relationship. October 1986, they meet again the year later. They meet in Reykjavik in Iceland as well. And this is where we see the impact of Chernobyl. And it was a real realization with the Chernobyl disaster that the Soviet Union did not possess the ability to control nuclear technology. He presses Reagan to give up SDI. Reagan is not unwilling. They're in the driving seat by this stage, but the relations are still good. But the key meeting, and you can see it's here being signed in the bottom right, is in the Washington summit in December of 1987. And this is where Gorbachev accepts that they're not going to scrap Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. But really, the best thing that the Soviet Union can hope for is general disarmament. So they're not going to get rid of things, but to generally decrease. So similar to SALT 1 and what SALT 2 tried to do. So this is where we see the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, but you can call it the INF Treaty. And this agreed that both countries would abolish all land-based missiles with a range from 500 to 5,500 kilometers as well. So we're starting to see this reduction of these intermediate missiles that could be fired on cities as well. So we're seeing a de-escalation in the arms race as well. The following year, in 1988, in Moscow, so they meet in Moscow, they resolve some of the complexities of the INF Treaty as well. Gorbachev travels to the United States eventually. He gives a speech to the United Nations, and he agrees that they will reduce the Warsaw Pact. So again, starting to that idea of de-escalation and reduction as well, and that the Soviets would leave Afghanistan. After nearly 10 years, they would leave Afghanistan. The final summit in 1989 at Malta, Reagan his second term was up as president, and the new president, his vice president, George Bush, meet at Malta. There was no formal agreements, but many people signified this summit at Malta as the end of the Cold War. Now, we talked about, obviously, glasnost and perestroika and the rejection of the Brezhnev Doctrine and the better relations between the USA and the Soviet Union. And this is where we see the end of the satellite states, the end of communism in Eastern Europe, and the ultimate end of the Soviet Union in 1991. So Gorbachev enables this. He doesn't intend it, but he enables it because of his approach to politics and glasnost and whatnot as well. And it's in May of 1989 in Hungary that we first see democratic elections as well. So by October, elections are being held. The government takes down the border fences with Austria as well, and democracy takes place. In June of 1989, Solidarity or Solidarność, which was a Polish trade union movement for togetherness, they win in a landslide victory in democratic elections. And the leader of that movement, Lech Walesa, becomes the first democratic elected president of Poland. We see in East Germany as well, Gorbachev refused to put down any of the demonstrations that were taking place. He'd removed himself from that. The Brezhnev Doctrine was no longer in force. And we start to see in November and October, people starting to attempt to cross the border for the first time as well. And the East German government are essentially powerless. In September of 1989, 125,000 East Germans crossed the border. In Czechoslovakia, they overthrow the communist government and have democratic elections in what's called the Velvet Revolution. So, 20 years after the Prague Spring, finally Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic as it becomes known, is now democratic. And we know that in November, obviously, the Berlin Wall famously comes down as well. It's more symbolic more than anything, but it really does symbolize the end of the Cold War. And then the month after that, we see Bulgaria and Romania also become independent as well, alongside the Baltic states in 1990 and 1991. And there's the wall coming down at that time as well. So with that, we see a final end. In 1990, Germany is officially reunified since the first time since 1945, and it is no longer West and East, it is Germany. We see, obviously, 1991, we see the rest of the former Soviet Union find independence, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. These are now independent countries with democracies. But what we do see is this trigger the complete collapse of the Soviet Union. Communism is abandoned, and Gorbachev in the end is actually ousted within the Soviet Union as well. He's seen as being weak, but by this time there's no stopping the unraveling and the end of communism, and it will become the Russian Federation, and they will have elections in that time as well. So that's the end of key topic 3. Again, hopefully the video has been informative and has been helpful, and tune in again for more videos on paper 2 of Anglo-Saxon and Norman England.